Welcome to episode 4 of the Social Permaculture Online Bootcamp. And thanks to everyone who's contacted me with feedback on the first 3 episodes. I really do appreciate you getting in touch. In this episode, we're going to build on a key theme from episode 3 around the power of networks. We're ready now to plunge into some nitty-gritty social permaculture analysis of our networks of relationships. And to do this, we're going to draw on the concept of social permaculture zones, which we'll use to inventory our network of interpersonal relationships. So why do this? If we're aiming to turbocharge our relationships for social transformation, we also need to be judicious about where we put in effort. We need to be thoughtful about how we locate fruitful collaborators, and to identify people who really nourish us as people, as well as also to pinpoint relationships that are unhealthy where we need to rebalance or even step away. Whatever's going on for you right now, the importance of meaningful connection has never been higher, and it's going to become even more important over time as our society inevitably changes with the ebbs and flows of the Anthropocene. Permaculture thinking has some great tools for mapping relationships between the elements of ecosystems, which are part of the design process. And one of these concepts is the concept of zones. So in permaculture design, the purpose of zones is to help strategize the placement of design elements on a land site. The objective is to increase the yield and the overall resilience of the site, while minimizing the input requirements and the needs for maintenance. So this is the embodiment of Bill Mollison's principle of minimal input for maximum effect. David Holmgren describes zones as a series of nested areas of decreasing intensity of use on a site. And we can see this depicted in the diagrams here. So this means placing those things that need the most maintenance in the most accessible spots on a site. So let's flesh this out quickly. Zone 0 is always the hub of the site, and that's the house or the homestead. Around that, you've got Zone 1, which is the kitchen garden for herbs and salad veggies, so things that will be used daily in cooking. Zone 2 is the more traditional veggie patch, and that could also include a chicken coop as well, but for stuff that you're going to use fairly regularly, but you don't have to traipse out to several times a day. Zone 3 could include less occasionally tended areas like orchards, beehives, or cash crops. Looking out to Zone 4, that's the more minimal care areas like woodlands or pastures, places that are good for foraging, for collecting wood fuel, etc. Zooming out from there, Zone 5 are the unmanaged areas, the forests or the ecosystem green belts or adjacent national parks, etc. These are the places that don't require any intervention at all. So when we're applying zones, strategies for managing plants and animals and other design elements should be different from each zone, because each zone has different requirements, has different attributes, and we're going to use each zone in different ways. There are a lot of great books out there that help to flesh out the zoning concept in permaculture design. I don't want to go into mega detail in this video here, but suffice to say I've found all of David Holmgren's works great on this, but particularly his book, Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. It's got a really good explanation of zoning in there, as well as Rosemary Morrow's book, The Earth User's Guide to Permaculture. I found this really practically helpful as well. But rest assured, there's no shortage of great information out there from a whole ream of different permaculture designers. So do check that out. It's easy to find. Now, how do we apply the permaculture zones concept in the social realm? We've got to start with the reference point. So the reference point for zones in a traditional permaculture design is a house on a block of land. But obviously that's not the case when we're looking in the social realm. So here the reference point is us, or more specifically you as an individual person. Now, unlike a house, people are mobile. We move around on foot, by car. We're mobile in where we live and work, etc., and where we travel. So we need to take that into account. Unlike a house, which is an object, people also interact with and influence everything around us in a really dynamic way. Our social and economic and political systems also add additional layers of complexity on top of the ecological systems that we live within. So we need to take that into account. Now, we can't directly transpose the zoning concept into social permaculture, but there are elements of the zoning concept that are really useful for the social permaculture practitioner. So for one, the core idea around frequency and intensity of use is something that we can draw from. In a social application, that might translate to frequency and intensity of interaction. The idea that different zones represent different scales of activity is also useful. So in social permaculture, we can look to different ways of interacting and different ways of organizing ourselves, depending on the number of participants, the functions and goals, and the scale of the activity that we're doing, among other things. So the zoning concept can help us decide which strategies are appropriate for which scale and which specific groups of people. So we're still maximizing our yield through hopefully the least effort. That's the core purpose of zoning, and that's something we can readily apply to social applications. The best book I've come across that deals specifically with social permaculture is Luby McNamara's People and Permaculture. So in the book, Luby McNamara has developed a set of social permaculture zones, this nested spatial model which helps us to map connections within our network of personal relationships. And you can see it here depicted on the slide. So basically it's a people map. It's about how we relate to the other people in our network of family and friends, acquaintances and colleagues. So it starts with the self in zone 00. So this is about the inner and outer work that the individual needs to undertake in themselves in order to be effective players in collaborative situations. But it also pays homage to the traditional zoning model, which places the household as zone 0. The household is still zone 0 in this model and includes your partners, spouses, children, housemates, etc. The other people that live in your housing situation. Zone 1 includes friends and extended family beyond the household, but still people that you're really close to. Zone 2 includes neighbours, work colleagues and school friends, etc. Zone 3 includes people we know further afield around our country of residence, while Zone 4 encompasses our network of contacts around the world that are beyond the country that we live in. Now, I loved this book when I came across it back in 2014, and I have made it a key part of my teaching into the series PDC. But the international relations scholar in me wasn't entirely comfortable with how we can apply this model. And in using it, doing activities with this in the PDC classes, some of the students tripped up a few times in figuring out how to apply this to their own lives. So one of the criticisms is that the spatial dimension of the social zones is not immediately clear. So some of my PDC students had trouble mapping out their relationships when the level of intimacy in these relationships didn't correlate with the physical distance. So that's one drawback of this model. It also lacks something that's integral to applying the people care and the fair share ethics of permaculture in the real world that is inherently unequal. And that's factoring in power relationships both between people and power relationships between people and systems of power. So we can superimpose all of the people and entities in Luby McNamara's model here, but we can do this within a more clearly defined structure of spatial organisation and political relationships. And I think this is important because politics and power are so integral to what happens in the social realms. We'll flesh out politics and power more in upcoming videos. But these criticisms notwithstanding, I really love this book and I strongly recommend it to you. I'll have a link to the full citation in the show notes. So before I show you my preferred tool for this kind of work, I want to introduce you to the concept of holons. And the holons theory comes out of theories of complex systems. And the idea here, as this graphic shows, is that any entity you can think of is simultaneously both a single system that's comprised of many constituent subsystems, but at the same time, it's also a subsystem itself of larger systems. And the graphic here, though simple, depicts that in a clear way. So any entity you can think of at any scale can be the full system itself, as well as a constituent of larger systems. Which brings us to my favoured model that I've been working on for a while. And I want to credit my great permaculture mentor, Graham George, for helping me really think hard about how I want to use this and what I want this model to be. So the model that I use is a model of political holons. And there's a few reasons why I want to have a model that's based on political holons. A political model makes sense to me because it has a clear spatial dimension. And because political systems, these are the primary ways that we organize ourselves for governance and decision making. Now, they're not the only ways. There are other ways that we organize ourselves. There are other ways that we collaborate, and there are other systems of power that affect us. But they can all be made sense of and located within a political holon framework. So if we look at this, a household is comprised of individuals, while at the same time is one of many households that comprise a municipality. A municipality itself is one of many that make up a state. A nation is comprised of many states or provinces, as well as being a constituent member of the international system, and so on and so forth. So you can see the holon concept at play here. When we apply this model, this is not strictly about zones, but we're going to use it for social zones here. But what we choose to locate at each level of scale in this model will depend on what kind of relationships we're applying the model to analyze. So in the activity for this video, we're going to apply this tool to map out our network of interpersonal relationships in the vein of social permaculture zones. So very much inspired by Luby McNamara's model, but just incorporating a couple of other dimensions. But in later videos, we'll use this same model for some different applications, and I'll flesh that out later on. Now, please bear with me if this sounds a little complicated. Remember that this is just one way of representing reality, and we're using this representation as a tool to try and learn something useful about our relationships and connections with other people. The aim here is to use that information to help us to connect and to collaborate more effectively to recover from the COVID-19 crisis and to transition to the post-carbon economy. So this is going to be one of our primary tools that we use in the Social Permaculture Online Bootcamp. So I hope you can get something out of using this. Our activity in this video, like all of the activities in the Social Permaculture Online Bootcamp, is about laying the foundation for COVID-19 resilience, for post-coronavirus recovery, and for post-carbon transition beyond that. And relationship building and horizontal networks are a key part of this project. So here in this activity, we're going to use the spatial scale tool that I just laid out for you to identify people who are positive and negative influences on our lives, and to identify where they are geographically relative to where we are. So what's the point of this? Well, this can help us to identify where we have strong relationships and where we can further build our relationships for maximum impact. It can also help us to see where the energy vampires are and to see where we need to devote less energy, or where it might be fruitful to do some relationship rebalancing. So let's do this. So step one here is to clarify what positive and what negative relationships actually mean to you, because you need to be able to define that to do the following steps. And it could mean something a little bit different for each person. So make sure you're really clear on what positive and negative relationships mean to you. Now then, at each level of scale, identify people who are positive influences on your life and people who are negative influences on your life. And start with your relationship with yourself. So that's at the bottom there in the graphic. And I know that's a loaded challenge. That's the psychologist's dream, to deconstruct this stuff. But it is important in how we interact in collectivities, how much self-knowledge we have, and how really in charge and aware of our shit we are. And that's a life project, so we're not solving anything here, but self-awareness is the key. And we'll come back to this in later episodes because it is important to social permaculture, the kind of self-work that you do. But don't dwell too long on that here, because next you want to move beyond yourself. So what about the relationships you have with the people in your household? What about at the municipal level? Who are the positive and negative relationships that you have in your community? And that could be at work, that could be anyone that you interact with around the city or around your local government area, etc. And then you're extending that out to relationships you have with other people in your state, around the country, and internationally. So use this grid. This will help you fill it out and keep it relatively simple. Now, next step from there, for each of the people that you identify, ask yourself why they're either positive or negative influences on your life. And when you do this, are there any common themes that come up that are worth noting and addressing? Also, for each person, identify the methods that you use to interact and communicate with these people. Ask yourself, does how you interact impact on the quality of those relationships? Take your time and be honest in your reflections. That's the best way to get something out of this. And please do use this grid that's illustrated here to help you complete this task. So pause the video here and have a go at fleshing this out. Okay, let's progress to step 2 now. And what is it that we can do with this information that we've filled up our grid with? Well, for a start, the positive influence people that you've identified are your life raft. They can be your candidates for mutual aid and political action, as well as sources of care and camaraderie and friendship. So what is it that you can do to foster each of these relationships? And what is it that you could do to expand your network of positive people? So have more of these positive relationships in your corner. And then ask similar questions of the negative influence people that you've listed. So these people can be vulnerabilities. So ask for each of these relationships, what is it that you could do to restore balance to those relationships? Or do you need to shield yourself or pull back from those negative influences? Looking on your grid as a whole, what are the state of these relationships telling you about where you're at? And what kind of self-help work might be good for you to pursue? So think of this activity as a preliminary scan. It'll help you to find the best place to start and where you can get the maximum bang for your buck in fostering your web of relationships. And this web of relationships, as I've stated before, will be really important as you try and achieve positive change at larger scales.